ghosts, psychics, pendulums, curses, hexes. We welcome you here to Friday Night Dark in the realm of the night. Come join us and listen to this week's presentation, and we bid you welcome. Hey, this is Drew, and I welcome you back to Friday Night Dark. Hey, tonight, I'm going to entertain you with a point of mind. What do I mean? Well, I need to throw some examples at you first, and then we'll certainly get on to the topic. Tonight, let's start with a few little things. Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings confronts the Balrog in the Mines of Moria. As he is about to descend into his doom, he yells out to the rest of the crew in the Fellowship of the Ring, "Run, you fools!" Or did he say that? Actually, the phrase he uses is, "Fly, you fools." But maybe perhaps some of you might not know that or have thought it was the previous comment. I'll let you decide, but I continue. Oreo. People say Oreos. The bag itself, everyone knows. Everyone knows about the particular version of Oreos. The bag for double stuff. But it's not double stuff spelled S-T-U-F-F. It's S-T-U-F. This is what makes it even crazier, is there are a lot of people who refer to it as double stuffed. Did you? Just wondering, but I continue. The other one here, Cheez-It. Some people refer to it as Cheez-Its. And do you spell it with an S or with a Z? A lot of people will spell it with an S, but on the end it's a Z, and it's just Cheez-It. It's not Cheez-Its with a Z on the end. Did you know that? These kind of spellings and these kind of things did actually win a lawsuit for Oreos because it was labeled for its packaging, and the point was that it wasn't double, which it wasn't. Actually, it was double stuff, S-T-U-F, so there was no stuffed in it. The same thing for Cheez-Its. No, there was no lawsuit, but a lot of people still refer to it as Cheez-Its with a Z on the end. And it gets creepier than that because there was actually some guy who tried to present some kind of a thing of old tech from the early 2000s, showing that in fact these things did exist with the spellings that people might have thought of. It could have been an electronic fabrication, but it brings about a very valid point. But I'm not done yet. Fruit of the Loom did not have a cornucopia on its logo, but major efforts have been made to prove that it did actually include that on its logo at one time from the vaults of the company itself. I know it sounds strange, and there was even a video where someone went rifling through somebody's closet just to find a t-shirt, and it showed all these little fruits that were on there and a cornucopia. So did it actually exist? Or perhaps maybe it was something that might have been from another time. Who knows? But I've got one more to actually share with you. Really, I do. And the last one I think is going to make the point. Nelson Mandela is a political leader who was in prison for a very long time. A lot of people still believe that he died in prison in the 80s. Actually, he was the president of South Africa after he was released, and he led the country until his demise in 2012. I know this makes things really, really weird and complicated, but it does actually articulate my point. You see, this is my shallow dive, if you will, into what's been termed the Mandela effect. Now, the phrase suggests that people didn't know Mandela was president of South Africa, but rather that he died in a prison cell. And, well, perhaps maybe they were thinking something that could have been some form of the truth. Perhaps. Maybe. See, there are all kinds of things out there that I poured through, some of them suggesting that something did happen and there was some reset. And the glimpses and these ideas of people in this group mind, if you will, were concluding things that weren't true or are not necessarily the same aspect that we might know. It's like that operator game I told you about where the word blue becomes cookie. You know which one I'm talking about. You start with a circle, they have to sit there and whisper a word, and as it goes around, they cannot repeat it. It can only do once, and they have to go all the way back. And I always use this example because it's the same idea. They would whisper this word. I'm going to start with the word blue, and it goes all the way around until finally it comes back and they blurt out the word cookie. I know it sounds strange when these things happen, but the truth is that memory has this way of changing, and in some cases might even break down and transform into something totally and truly different from what it is. I know this is maddening, but it happens in games and in how we collectively remember things of the past. Truly it does. There are some candies that I remember having from way back when, like Now and Later, Jolly Ranchers. I loved having those. There's also Bazooka Joe. Or was it Bazooka Joe's? I know a lot of people will probably sit there and say, but it says this. It's true. It might have. Maybe it didn't. And you just remembered it that way. And this goes into a bigger phrase. The Mandela effect itself is a term that is the result of one Fiona Broome, and it was coined in 2009. See, but the concept may be in question itself, couldn't it? You see, people had talked about things that were in fact true, maybe not true. I'm sure you've seen the commercials way back when, if you're as old as me. The National Enquirer, they talked about things from UFOs that landed, and they would tell you where they are, to things like even you can use your ESP to play guitar. I might be quoting a bad lyric from a really bad spoof to that song. What was it? Midnight Star. Yeah, something. I don't remember. Or do I? I don't know. But here's the thing, is that the concept of these really weird and arcane types of knowledge that seemed pretty commonwealth for some people, and yet in some instances it might actually be something that may not be true. Or there might be some truth to it, but it might be altered just enough. And much like that game, that operator game where the kids go around and they say something and then eventually it turns into something else. The color blue becomes the word cookie. So is it really Bazooka Joe or is it Bazooka Joe's? Now I remember saying Bazooka Joe's when I had a plural amount, which was common, especially if I was really good and I went to the barber shop. He gave me 2 Bazooka Joe's. But I digress. Getting back to everything here. What really is one of the things I remember most is when Elvis died. And I know a lot of people think that he just died of old age or whatnot. He actually died still pretty young. And it was in the 70s. And I remember they made a big deal out of his funeral. But then there were these reports that he died, but he didn't die. And people were starting to say they were seeing him walk all over the places and hiding his identity and what have you. And even to the point where there was a conspiracy theory that had been actually cooked up that he was still at Graceland and he was in some kind of room where he pretty much couldn't leave, and only certain people were allowed past a certain point in Graceland. And the reasoning behind it was that the mob was actually after him and he crossed them. and he had a contract out for his death. So you can kind of see where perhaps maybe faking his own death might be of some benefit. Was it? We'll never know. But there's also talk of a scene where someone was seen jumping to his death, hanging himself in the background in The Wizard of Oz. And the scene itself is where they're actually entering the spooky forest leading to the Wicked Witch of the West. And it is a scene that was removed from the movie. It wasn't until much, much later it was released in its entirety, which had the song The Jitterbug, or Jitterbugs. I can't remember. Anyhow, there is still talk that they managed to find a way to either wipe away or to edit out that whole scene where that person was jumping to their death. And still yet others say that it was always there. I don't seem to recall that whole jitterbug scene until much later in life, but I do remember the whole thing with that jumping to his death comment. This was, by the way, reported on that whole National Enquirer thing. Now you're wondering, where am I going with all this? You see, even on the internet, there were things that the truth seems to have been distorted. And I know there's always that joke about how the internet never lies, right? Well, I would like to say that it presents a certain point of view. And so, bearing that in mind, I'd also like to point out that this whole Mandela effect that this Fiona Broom had actually presented might actually have some truth to the idea. So this particular paranormal researcher who coined that phrase will tell you, it's really so, that this Mandela effect is real. Not because she wants to prove anything, but because it forces the question of, is the perception of our memories real? After all, if something happens, we're either going to remember it or we're not. Do you remember every detail, or do you only remember the high points of whatever it is you're trying to recall? Miss Broom revels unabashed in the idea that this is kind of like a doppelganger existence. But there is another way to see this, perhaps. I have to bring up another concept of science. I know. Don't worry, it's not going to be long and it will be painless. Let's look at quantum mechanics. Now, I'm not going to wrap up completely in the science of it, but she does, Miss Broom, of course, see that the whole Mandela effect is an actual outcome of quantum mechanics. She revels in that idea. And she also brings about this whole doppelganger scene, or doppelganger. Now, doppelganger is a German phrase that's used to explain somebody that is an alternate and yet the same person. That means an exact double to yourself. But their existence will be something completely to the antithesis of how you are. So if you're not doing so well and you're broke all the time, there might be an opposite to you that is well-to-do and is always doing things and spending money and keeping the economy moving around. And so there are several stories to that effect about this doppelganger existence, almost to the point of that some stories were actually true and unexplainable. So you can kind of see where the roots of her premise would be coming from. And she hangs on to this, but I would still want to talk about quantum mechanics in a way, because there is also this other theory. And I'm talking about the Schrödinger cat theory. Now, in it, you have a cat, you have this like subatomic particle, then you have like this radioactive material, and you have a Geiger counter in a box. And the way it works is that we don't know if the cat is alive or dead. The Geiger counter hasn't gotten off, signal that there's radiation in the box, so it's possible this cat is alive. It's also possible this cat is dead. Now, I had a friend who actually went about this in a different way. He just had a box, and he had truly a cat in there that was stuffed. But he didn't tell that to people. However, I heard through the grapevine, probably that same telephone operator circle, it went from blue to cookie. They said that he did actually have a live cat once. I'm not going to go there today. But the point of the matter is that the Schrödinger cat theory doesn't necessarily talk about the demise or the life of that cat, but rather that it was all aspects all at the same time. You see, that subatomic or atomic particle that's in the box with the cat and that radioactive whatever holder, that subatomic particle is called a superposition, and this is where they say that the cat is actually all aspects of existence at the same time. It is alive, it is dead, and it is everything else in between, which means that there are several million possibilities with the existence of this cat. And I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out, because you're going to see where this is all going to lead. If you already see it, don't tell it for anybody else. Let me go through this, because I think in some ways this is where the whole paranormal idea of the Mandela effect starts to carry some water. You see, if in fact there's several different existences of that same cat, then you would have to think to yourself that perhaps if all the results can happen at the same time, can you also have several different aspects of existence of the same cat in parallel to each other? Maybe out of sync by a couple of seconds, but yet here they are. So I could be talking on a podcast in a radioactive world in one of those types of instances. Or perhaps maybe I'm not talking about this podcast. I might just be having this conversation with a couple of people that are in front of me right now for absolutely no reason. It's just happening. Who knows? There's a TV show that I watched a while back. It's called Dark Matter. And I watched it on one of those streaming shows, and it talks about the many, many different realities of one man. One aspect of himself steals his own identity and then tries to live his life, but yet make it his own. And the other person fights to actually come back and reclaim it. But he's got to find his way home. Here's the chilling part. How many times do you think he did it? Now, I won't spoil it completely, but it does actually pose a question. Is that if in fact this person had so many different aspects at the same time, is it possible then that maybe there are so many different aspects? Let's go back again and let's talk about Oreos double stuffed. Perhaps maybe there was a bag that was printed double stuffed. Maybe their lawsuit didn't lose. Maybe it won. And they had to go and put double of everything in there. Maybe there is a Cheez-Its where it's spelled with a Z both on the cheese and on its at the end, meaning it's plural. Cheez-Its, as opposed to just Cheez-It. Maybe there is an aspect of a cornucopia, or perhaps maybe there is an aspect where Nelson Mandela truly did die in a cell in the 80s. I know this seems like crazy stuff, but I want to make this a very valid point, is that if one existence lives, perhaps there is another behind it, out of sync perhaps, or maybe it's totally and completely divergent from the timeline that you and I suffer right now as we're hearing this show. It's crazy, I think, but at the same time, I'd have to think if there could be millions and millions of different realities of the same person's life, could there be millions and millions of different aspects and realities of your life, my life, the reality that we live in? That's crazy. It boggles my mind. How about you? Well, I'll let you spin on that one for a little bit. But this is why I mentioned it. And that is, if those other realities permeated into our reality or vice versa, do you think this hinges off of the rail and some kind of thinking? I would say no. if the doppelganger effect that Miss Fiona Broom had purported to say that this Mandela effect is an example of, well, she isn't necessarily quoting something that's from one particular location or culture. Yes, that's right. I'm going to go back to Egypt. In olden times, there was this spirit double referred to as Ka, and it was always some dark or alternate existence. Now, consequently, in the Middle East, when Zoroastrianism fell to Islam, the Muslim culture still believed in what they called a Karen or a Quran, or I'm hooked on phonics, so if I say it wrong, I'm going to beg the forgiveness of everybody here. But they talk about that they are a dark and nefarious alternate of yourself, in which they might have a more feral or dubious nature to them. And so going back to that whole aspect, this wouldn't have come about unless somehow there was a glimpse that was tangible enough for these folks to actually purport and propose this very idea of a doppelganger, or a Ka, or a Karen. So you see where I'm going with this. There's got to be some roots in the idea, and I think all that Fiona Broom did was kind of say, hey, it exists, guys, look. And then they spout out a whole bunch of things, and a lot of people were like, yeah, I remember that. Well, I remembered certain things a certain way, and I remember when someone actually approached me on this whole Mandela effect thing. This was back in circa 2015. There was someone there who came up to me and he said, hey, Drew, do you remember Nelson Mandela, is the way he actually approached me? And I said, yeah. And then he said, what do you know about him? And I said, well, you head honcho of the South African government. I know he died a few years back, but he was, pretty instrumental in kind of putting South Africa together in such a way that it was not the same South Africa that I remember back in the 80s. And he chuckled and he says, yeah, he says, most people would have said he died in a prison cell in the 80s. I'm like, well, no, I happen to know that because I remember watching the funeral they had, and there was a big joke about some political figures that were, the only time they ever slept together. I don't like talking politics, but that was what made me remember it. And so they went on to talk about the Mandela effect. They never mentioned Miss Broom by name, but they did say that this was a concept that was going around and round on the internet. And I said, well, that's nice. And I shrugged it off. Later, much, much later, I found out that, there was these doppelganger type things, and there is these nefarious doubles, and it can be something of an antithesis of oneself, or it could be something that brings in that possibility of perhaps another person that existed and did something completely different from what you would have done, but is still you. Or it could be something completely, off tangent, but that goes back to what I was saying before. You have this other person, this, I guess, ideologue of a person that could be doing the exact opposite of what you set out to do yourself. Maybe there isn't just one double. What if there were millions of you out there? Not necessarily in this reality, but somehow there might be crossovers of those realities. And someone could have said, hey, didn't I see you over there? Now, I might be bringing up that whole concept of bilocation, which I don't want to get into today, but it does also kind of add some credence to the whole Mandela effect. Did we perhaps exist in another timeline and another aspect of us crossed over where people could have seen this? It's very possible. Remember, there's different, and I'm not talking one, but perhaps millions of versions of ourselves. And so if they did cross over with somebody there looking for you, or not looking for you for that matter, and they see you, and then you disappear. You see where I'm going with this? It in itself would mean that maybe in that other existence somewhere, as I mentioned, Jif might become Jiffy. And that cornucopia, that might actually be that famous emblem on that company, Fruit of the Loom. I'm not giving these plugs to companies for the sake of just, some kind of endorsement, but rather examples. Maybe Elvis never died. Perhaps, well, should I say, didn't die in the 70s. Maybe in some aspect he was alive until well into the late 90s. Who knows? But in any of those cases, there is this group mind that is seeing beyond our own existence and into another, perhaps. And these aspects peak and permeate into those ideas all the time. Maybe it might be why we have these ideas of something that could be different. Cheez-Its is what it is. Double stuffed is actually double stuffed and not just double stuff with a single F on it. I'm still kind of judging on this one, really honestly. And I know it seems kind of far-fetched and odd, but at least you'll know that this is one of those things that is kind of a rabbit hole, if you will. And as I was doing my research, I can certainly tell you for sure that this is something that I could dig into without any trouble, and I could find several, and I mean several examples without trying. There's videos all about this. What makes mine different is they just kind of present the idea of that these things didn't exist, and they'll go about debunking it. But you see, Fiona Broome, she did say something. She unabashedly had pointed out that she didn't need to prove it. That the group mind, if you will, that whole bandwagon theory of existence of these different things might just be another pinhole of something that's crossed over into our own reality. And we got a glimpse of something different from what we once thought. Even that one guy, that spooky old tech person that actually found a way to show some electronic fabrication of products of yesteryear that did say these things. Maybe they did and maybe they didn't exist. It would be hard to say, especially in this day and age where even the very things that we have can be made to deceive us. Wait, that was a famous line too. But anyhow, as confusing as it could be, the Mandela effect itself, I think, does propose another idea and another concept. The concept that it brings up is, what if these other realities do exist? And that is what I'm trying to bring about. And I want to emphasize it not to the point where I'm just kind of running it into the ground, but rather that I think as much as the other theories and people that go about debunking it, it needs to be brought about that maybe there's a reason why there's such a driving force behind it. I don't think people are refusing to accept the truth. I think people are looking at the idea that, in their mind, this is what exists. Does that exist for you? Well, you can be the judge, and you can certainly tell us. And hopefully somewhere in there, you might tell me. Where else? Friday Night Dark at nighttracks.com. Or you can just go ahead and leave a comment below, wherever you happen to be hearing this. With that, this is Drew, and I bid you good night.
Thanks for listening to Friday Night Dark. Coffee is one of those items you drink in the morning. With dessert. Perhaps whenever it's late. Or maybe even when it's a long day or night. Try Coffee USA for all your coffee supplies and needs. If you follow our link down below, you can enter a code at checkout. Friday Night Dark. Then when you make your purchase, you will get an extra 10% off. Come give it a try and see for yourself. Thanks for looking and thanks for listening to us here at nighttracks.com.